All right, welcome back to another lesson. This is going to be 18.3. We're going to talk about reproduction in animals. Remember, we're in the kingdom, we're in the domain eukaryotes and in the kingdom Animalia. But there's different types of animals. There's different phylums, obviously, and then out of those phylums, there's different classes and orders, of course, family, genus, species, all that. But we're still talking about animals here and all different types of animals that are out there. And so remember, even insects are animals. And so they all reproduce a little bit differently. And so that's kind of the goal of this lesson, is to talk about what reproduction is according to different organisms or different species. And so we'll focus on a few different things. Let me tell you what this lesson is not. It's not an anatomy and physiology lesson. So we're not going to go over the organs involved for reproduction. It's also not we're not getting too deep into like the genetics and like meiosis. So we've already done all that. We've covered meiosis in another chapter, but we're going to talk about just what reproduction looks like according to different animals again. All right, so follow with me here into the lesson here. We're going to look at how asexual and sexual reproduction differ. I'm pretty sure we've already covered those terms. We're going to see how internal and external fertilization differ. Those are pretty obvious right there just from the words, internal and external. We're going to look at where embryos develop, because that's different depending on what species you are. And then we're going to really kind of look at how terrestrial vertebrates are adapted or created in such a way that they can reproduce on land, because that's going to pose a special difficulty there. And so I like this introduction paragraph, so I kind of wanted to read that. Sexual reproduction can be dangerous. Just ask a male praying mantis who may be devoured by his mate. I think pretty sure I saw an episode of that on one of the Planet Earth videos or something like that, or a YouTube video where it showed that the male praying mantis actually gets devoured. He gets eaten by the female. It's kind of a sad story. Or a male peacock whose success in courting a female depends on his growing and lugging around a huge tail that makes it harder for him to escape predators. We actually have some wild peacocks living in our neighborhood, actually, up in North Waterman by the 18 at the bottom of the mountain. That's where I live, and there's some wild peacocks that run around, and saw one on our walk the other day. They have this huge tail that's like bigger than they are, and you think, man, wouldn't that be inconvenient? But that's so it can show off, as most birds do, for the female, so that they can reproduce. How about a male emperor penguin? I know I remember that documentary. I'm pretty sure that one was Planet Earth, but there's even a movie about penguins too. And it's the male who actually incubates the egg for months on Antarctic ice in temperatures far below zero. It's so heartbreaking to watch the male emperor penguin sit on that egg. It's kind of like payback, huh? The male sits there just shivering, and you know he's cold. I mean, when you look at the DVD or whatever, the movie, it's pretty sad. Okay, so how about a female deer who carries around the ever-increasing weight of her developing young for 7 months while she runs from predators such as coyotes and seeks food for herself? All right, that deer is going to be quite, much larger than a human would be. But yeah, most animal species engage in sexual reproduction during at least part of their life cycles. Why? Well, duh, they got to keep the species going, right? In fact, this is one of God's first commandments before he gave any other commandments. Even before he told Adam and Eve not to eat the fruit, he said, be fruitful and multiply. That was one of the first things he said. So it's a commandment to keep the species going. It's very important that reproduction happens. Evolutionists say that this is right here, reproduction is kind of the whole point of life, is to reproduce and obviously to eat. So to eat and reproduce, because eating gives you the energy to reproduce, and that's kind of it. But that to me seems a little shallow. But I do think that even God recognized how important it was for us to reproduce, so that the species can continue. Right? He even realized, hey, I can't sit here by myself. I gotta reproduce. So he made us in his own image, which is pretty awesome too. But there's all kinds of different animals that are out there, right? And So we're going to see how those differ. First, let's look at asexual and sexual reproduction, how those two terms differ. So if you remember, we had this lesson before. Asexual reproduction means that only one parent is involved. So if you remember from meiosis and genetics, that means that the DNA is going to be from one parent. So you're not going to get any genetic diversity. And so guess what? There's going to be some advantages and disadvantages to that. What are the advantages? Well, if environmental conditions are favorable and you're not really worried about too much, then you can actually do this pretty quickly. There's no time wasted or energy wasted in finding another mate to do this. You can just asexually reproduce. Now that again can look a little bit different depending on the organism, but the point is the offspring are going to have the same DNA as the parent. And so there's actually no, I wouldn't say less genetic diversity, I would say no genetic diversity as compared to sexual reproduction. And so that's actually a disadvantage, because what if environmental changes do occur? Well, guess what? The DNA may not code for the best proteins, and so that organism won't be fit for survival. Evolutionists, remember, refer to that term survival of the fittest. And so how are you going to even have a situation where there are some fittest organisms? You're just not going to have any changes. And so it's important, even if you're not an evolutionist and you're a creationist, you believe that God created diversity, and that's so that we could all kind of complement each other. And it would be foolish for all organisms to be the exact same. That would just be really foolish. Because if a mass change happened, there would be a mass catastrophe and all the organisms would die at once. Sexual reproduction is the opposite. It's actually going to have genetic diversity. It's going to maintain a lot of genetic diversity because you're always creating individuals with new combinations of genes. Remember, because you're taking the gametes of one organism, the male, and combining them with the gametes of another organism, which is female. And then when you combine the gametes, you're combining DNA. You're giving one copy of, you're giving dad's version and mom's version of all the genes. So you remember all those analogies from genetics and meiosis. All right, so genetic diversity is awesome for sexual reproduction because it allows for organisms and species to respond to changes. If there's a change, well, yeah, maybe some people don't have the good DNA for that, and so they'll die out. But a bunch of other organisms they'll have already made some adaptations or some changes, and there's going to be some diversity, and so they might be in the group that survives. And so at least you have a group surviving, right? If temperatures go up or acidity goes up or down, pH goes up or down, there's a number of factors that can change. But remember, sexual reproduction is when you have two parents, a male and a female, and both of them carry sex cells that are designed to come together, and they're called sperm and eggs. The sperm, remember, carries the sperm is the gamete for a male, which carries half the DNA, or well, a full set of chromosomes, but only like one version, only the dad's version. And then for the female, the gametes are called eggs. All right, those are specialized sex cells that we refer to as gametes, and those will be the eggs for females. Well, the sperm and egg come together with each, only half the chromosomes, essentially. So you're going to have dad's version and mom's versions come together to make a zygote. And that zygote will eventually be an embryo, which we'll talk about how that can develop in different organisms. But you're always going to get a new combination every time, even with the same parents. So you can take the same male and same female, reproduce them multiple times, and keep getting different results, which is pretty awesome. Okay, so you can read on in here. I'm going to try to breeze through this a little fast because this section is really long. So I want to cover everything. I want to cover the main points. So you can tell I'm reading these key sentences here and key answers. But if you want to look at examples, you can do that down here. This example I did want to bring up real quick. So it says here, there are annelids, which are like worms, mollusks, like, mussels and shells in the ocean, and fishes. There are some of those that are hermaphrodites. If you've ever heard of that term, hermaphrodite, that actually can even occur in a human being where they're both male and female. Literally, they were born that way, as a male and a female, sort of having both organs. Usually hermaphrodites, though, in humans, that's kind of a genetic, that's probably caused from a mutation in the genes, because we're not designed to be hermaphrodites. But some animals are designed to be hermaphrodites, and that's okay. And they can even reproduce sexually, actually. That's what this paragraph is trying to say. Some individuals, they'll release eggs and sperm at the same time. But it's interesting to note, you should note this, that even though they do that, like a fish, for example, a fish that releases eggs and sperm at the same time, they don't actually fertilize their own eggs. But instead, they'll exchange sperm with another individual's eggs, and then vice versa. Their eggs will be fertilized by someone else's sperm. But they have both. And there are cycles too, reproductive cycles, that alternate even back and forth between sexual and asexual. So sometimes the organism does sexual reproduction, sometimes it does asexual. But back on the hermaphrodites, I wanted to stay on that for a second because I wanted to show you a picture of a hermaphrodite. This is a California sheephead. What a fish, huh? Look at this thing. Look at that. I caught one of these once, kayak fishing. It was not that big, by the way, but I was so excited when I found it because it's like an exciting fish to catch because they can get real big like that, and they put up a real good fight. And they're just beautiful. Look at that. I mean, like, they're exotic looking, I should say. I wouldn't say beautiful. Look at those teeth. And it actually had those teeth when I caught it, and so I had to go home and do research to figure out what I caught because I was like, what in the world? It didn't have regular teeth. But the one I caught was more like this size, about like this. And it was just, it didn't have any kind of crazy colors to it, but it had those little teeth like that, like sharp, pointy teeth. And they weren't like razor sharp, but they were pointed. And that's actually so they can break open shellfish. They're kind of bottom feeders. They break open shellfish and eat those. And so here you go. Here's the life cycle. I probably should be looking at this image here. The females, they're all born female like this. They're all born female. And then at some point in their life, the juveniles are all just kind of, they're all both. They're both hermaphrodites, but they turn into females. And then the females, after a few years, will, if the conditions are right or whatever, they'll turn into a male. And the males then get like twice the size. They grow those really dark black stripes. Pretty cool looking. So the males are really fun to catch just because they're actually, to me, they do look really, really cool. I love the male California sheephead. That's what they're called, California sheephead. And so, again, you have kind of a hermaphroditic fish that will, at some point in its life cycle, be a female, or it could be a male later on in its life cycle. If it doesn't become a male, then it'll just continue to stay a female. All right, cool. That was just a neat example of a hermaphrodite, because when I read that, I was inspired to show you that. Again, I'm not going to read all of this stuff, though. Like the clownfish is kind of the same situation. Clownfish, like Finding Nemo, can start out female, and then as it grows, it can become a male. Or both at the same time. Okay, so reproductive cycles, though. Invertebrates have life cycles that alternate back and forth between sexual and asexual. Parasitic worms and cnidarians alternate between forms that reproduce sexually and forms that reproduce asexually. And so what do we mean by that? Like, for example, parasitic worms, such as blood flukes, they mature inside the body of an infected person. They reproduce sexually, and then that means with another worm, and then they release embryos that pass out of the body in the feces. If the embryos reach fresh water, they develop into these larvae that infect snails, and then they reproduce asexually inside the snail. Then the larvae are released, and then they are ready to infect another person. Cnidarians, which are jellyfish, will do sort of a similar thing where they go from asexual to sexual. So here's a life cycle. They're just it's way easier to teach this with an image here. So I'm going to use this image to teach you. Now, important legend here is the haploid and the diploid colors that will guide us through this life cycle. So this is the life cycle of a jellyfish. You can look these up for any organism. Every organism has a life cycle. And they're kind of fun to study for certain organisms because they actually do a lot of changing, like butterflies, and we'll talk about that in a second. But every organism has a life cycle. And for jellyfish, there's a time when they're haploid, in which they will have half the chromosomes, or just one version, a full set of chromosomes, but just one version. And then there's times when they have both versions, mom's version and dad's versions of the DNA. Mom's versions of the chromosomes, and dad's versions of the chromosomes, I should say. Both versions, mom and dad's. And so 2N is what we call it, or diploid. And most of the time it's diploid. So here's how we start. Let's start at the bottom here. So for jellyfish, you'll have like this polyp attached to a rock. And the polyp will just bud off asexually. Just asexually, which means literally the budding polyp is going to have the same DNA as this polyp. It's budding off, so it has the same DNA, no diversity there. And then it'll just bud off completely, and it'll end up being what we call a young medusa. And these medusas are like young jellyfish, sort of. And again, they have the same DNA as this polyp. The same DNA. Well, then they grow up to be adult medusas, which are what we call jellyfish. They actually look like jellyfish. These are adult medusas, and you can have a male medusa or you can have a female medusa. But at this point, again, they still have they're 2N. They have two versions of all chromosomes. They have two versions, a mom version and a dad version. Well, let's say they want to reproduce. They do so by, if they're female, making eggs. If they're male, making sperm. Now remember, when you make sperm or you make eggs, that process is called meiosis. And so you're making cells that are only 1N. The sperm and the egg are just 1N. They only have one set of chromosomes, not two. The male is donating dad's version. The female is donating the female's mom's version. And then those versions will get together to make a zygote. That's called fertilization. So this egg is not the zygote, but once the sperm reaches the egg and goes inside of the egg, then it makes the zygote, which is 2N. There's mom's version and dad's version there. Okay? And the zygote can then grow. In this case, it actually turns into like a swimming larva, which at some point will then turn into a polyp. But 2N at this point. And then again, the process will repeat. It'll turn into a polyp, but as it's a polyp, again, it reproduces asexually. And then as an adult medusa or adult jellyfish, then it reproduces sexually. So asexual, sexual. All right. Alternating reproductive life cycles. Okay, so let's talk about how internal and external fertilization differ. Real, again, obvious by the terms here. Internal, which means inside, and external, which means outside. And so you guessed it, internal fertilization is when eggs are fertilized inside the body of the egg-producing individual. So, like, for example, invertebrates, they do that. They're going to be, different types of organisms such as sponges or arachnids, which are like spiders. The eggs of sponges and some other aquatic animals are fertilized by sperm released by others of their species and taken in from the surrounding water. In arthropod species, males deposit sperm inside the female's body during mating. So either way, the eggs get fertilized inside the organisms, but not all the time does the male inject the sperm into the female. So what it's saying here at the top was, that eggs of sponges and some other aquatic animals are fertilized by sperm that are released into the environment, into the surrounding water, and then they're taken in. So the male just releases the sperm in the water, and then the female will take the sperm in. But chordates, which would be some fishes and amphibians and all reptiles, birds, and mammals, are going to reproduce by internal fertilization. But it can vary. So, like for amphibians, they deposit sperm packets to the environment, just to the surrounding environment. Females will then pick up those packets and take them inside their bodies. Okay, they're taking in the sperm, but never was there an organ put inside the body. Remember that. So, but in other chordate species, like humans, for example, males actually have an external sexual organ that they literally use to deposit sperm inside the female during mating. All right, and so that's the process that humans use, and a lot of chordates and vertebrates that have a backbone, terrestrial as well, will use that method. But if they're not terrestrial and they're aquatic, it's easy to just release the sperm into the water, and then the females can then take the sperm in. But the point is, it's still internal fertilization, because fertilization, where egg meets sperm, that process happens inside the organism. Contrast that to external fertilization. You would see a lot of fish do this. Fish will release sperm into the water like this at certain times of year, whether it's spring or whatever, usually springtime, when the waters start to warm up. There's a certain temperature at which, like when I go fishing, for example, like if I go to a freshwater lake, this is a saltwater wrasse in this picture, but pretend it's a freshwater bass. What they like to do is they like to deposit their sperm on top of a bed of eggs that a female have released, and then all that fertilization happens external. The female's gone swimming around, the male's gone swimming around, but yet here's this bed of eggs with sperm being dropped on top, and the fertilization happens there with no organism still around. Now, I should be careful how I say that, because that's actually not true. The males and females do hang around to guard the nest, basically from predators trying to eat the eggs, but that's not part of the reproduction process. They're just there hanging out, guarding the nests and being real territorial, and that's why it's actually easy to catch fish during the spawn. And in some species, it's actually illegal to fish for that species during spawning season, because it's too easy, and then you basically wipe out that species a lot easier, because you're catching them when they're real vulnerable like that. And so for sport fishing, though, sometimes you can catch and release, whatever, just as long as the numbers are okay, then the fishing game, they'll monitor that stuff and they'll say it's okay. But the point here is that all this was external. The fertilization, the eggs and the sperm, happened outside of the body of the egg-producing individual. It's always outside of the sperm-producing individual. No sperm-producing individual, or I should say no male, is ever fertilizing eggs inside of their body. That never happens. It's the egg-producing. It's the females that are going to either... I'm going to be careful how I say this, because later on we're going to talk about kangaroos that have babies in their pouch, and that's different. That's different about how the embryo develops in the egg or whatever. The point we're making here is that fertilization, where the egg and sperm come together, that either happens inside the female or outside the female. Okay, again, so once the fertilization happens, you end up having what's called a zygote. And that zygote is essentially your embryo. And so let's answer this question: where do embryos develop? Because no matter what type of fertilization you do, internal or external, you're going to now have an embryo that needs to develop. And that can look a little bit different depending on the different species. For oviparous species, the way you pronounce this word is oviparous. These are tricky words, so let's use the little pronunciation tool here. I'm sure there's a name for that, but I don't know what it is. The pronunciation tool says that this is oviparous. That's the first species we're going to talk about, like a bird, for example. Here's a robin. Saw one of those yesterday at Big Bear Lake, fishing, doing one of my favorite hobbies. I was on the North Shore, and their robin came by and just singing songs, and my wife made a little comment about the robin singing from a song that she knew. They have the real beautiful, like red colored breast here. And so birds are going to be great examples of oviparous species. And those are going to be in which embryos develop inside of eggs outside of the parent's body. Basically, most invertebrates, many fishes, and amphibians, most reptiles, all birds, and few odd mammals are oviparous. Again, oviparous means that the egg is totally outside of the bird, of the parent, and it's getting all its nutrition away from the parent. It's ready to go. As soon as the parent releases the egg, it's all on its own, sort of. Not really on its own, but you know what I mean. Like, there's no nutrition swapping there. There's no oxygen and gas exchanges between mom and baby there. There's no regulation there except for maybe guarding the nest. Here's the tricky one to say. Ovoviviparous. Ovoviviparous. It's not ovoviviparous. Ovoviviparous. It's ovovi. Vy is like V. Ovoviviparous. Ovoviviparous is how you would say it. Ovoviviparous. And this would be viviparous down here. But let's actually talk about viviparous first, because this was in the middle one's kind of in the middle ground. And the oviparous and viviparous are on the two extremes. So remember, the first extreme was totally outside the body. Viviparous is at the other end of the spectrum here. That means that the species are going to have embryos that obtain nutrients from the mother during development. Right? That would be like human beings or horses, cows, or large mammals that have, but even, some bony fishes, amphibians, and reptiles, and even some insects, sharks and such. But the point is, for viviparous species, the young are nourished by either secretions produced by the mother in the reproductive tract or inside of a placenta, which is a really modified place, a super specialized organ that enables the exchange of even respiratory gases, nutrients, and waste between the mother and her developing young. So your belly button, that's where that's where you were once connected to your mother's placenta. That thing got cut, and that's why you have the little knot there in your belly button. But that's where the cord used to go into your stomach, or go into your abdomen. And there were blood vessels inside of that umbilical cord that allowed you to get your oxygen, get rid of your carbon dioxide, allowed you to get your nutrients, and even get rid of your waste. So when mom is going to the bathroom, she's actually getting rid of your waste too if you're a baby. All right, so the placenta is a super awesome specialized organ for that. Now, in the middle ground is ovoviviparous. So you're in between oviparous and viviparous. You're ovoviviparous. And those are embryos that develop within the mother's body, but they depend still entirely on the yolk sac of their eggs. So it's kind of like a bird that had an egg but kept the egg inside of it. And so a guppy is a good example of that. Again, the young do not receive any additional nutrients from mom. The species will hatch within the mother's body and or released immediately before hatching. And so then they will swim freely shortly after hatching. Guppies and other fishes in the family, along with some shark species, are ovoviviparous. So they're still in like an egg, meaning they don't get like extra nutrients from mom, but they stay with mom until like the last minute. Whereas eggs for birds are usually left to incubate inside of a warm place or whatever. And so, all right, now, how do young develop, regardless of their situation? Well, regardless of whether they're any of these three, how do they develop? Well, obviously they need nutrients and all that and stuff, but what we're going to be talking about is like their life cycles. And so there's a term called metamorphosis, I'm sure you've heard, in regards to butterflies, and that's a developmental process that leads to dramatic changes in shape and form. And so let's look at aquatic invertebrates first, and then we'll look at terrestrial invertebrates. Remember, invertebrates means you do not have a backbone. So for water-dwelling aquatic invertebrates, they're going to have a larval stage, which looks nothing like an adult. The larvae, and that we saw an example of that up here, like the jellyfish, you have a swimming larva that ends up being like a polyp. Again, the larvae doesn't even look like the polyp. And the polyp, remember, turns into the jellyfish, whatever. But the point here is that aquatic invertebrates usually have some larvae that swim around, and then they're going to undergo metamorphosis at the right conditions. And sometimes it's just a single larvae stage, but some organisms, like crustaceans, they may pass through several different larval stages before they actually look like miniature adults. Terrestrial invertebrates, so these are land-dwelling invertebrates that don't have a backbone, like insects, for example, they may undergo one of two types of metamorphosis. There's going to be complete or incomplete. Some insects, such as grasshoppers, undergo a gradual or incomplete metamorphosis. So that would be like this, this. I'm not going to say it's a fly because it's not a fly. It's a chinch bug. A chinch bug on the left here. It's going to go through a stage in which it becomes a nymph. So the adult will lay some eggs. The eggs will hatch into these nymphs. Now the nymphs are kind of like the adult. They look like the adult, but they're missing some things. Like in this case, they're missing the wings. So at some point, when this organism is ready to be an adult, it'll grow the wings and a few other features that make it really, really resemble the adult stage. But you basically have two phases, the immature phase and the mature phase in blue, the adult phase in blue. Green is immature, blue is adult. All right. Now you have, that's called incomplete metamorphosis. Then you have complete metamorphosis. Now it would be like a butterfly where you literally go through total complete metamorphosis. Like, for example, this ladybug, the adult ladybug will lay some eggs. And then this would be the immature phase already in green. And then it'll turn into a larvae, which this doesn't look anything like a ladybug. And then that larvae will then turn into a pupa, which doesn't even look like the larva. And then the pupa, when it's ready, will become like an adult. And then the adult can even go through some minor changes there, but still it's an adult already. This ladybug and this ladybug are both adults. One's male, one's female. But you can see here, and really they should have shown you a butterfly example, because if you read this, or if you've ever seen this with butterflies, they start out as caterpillars, which look extremely different than a butterfly. And what's so awesome, some people go on, some people get obsessed with this. I know some people that are obsessed with caterpillars and turning them into butterflies, and they'll either have like a butterfly farm, or they'll go to zoos. And like, I have a couple friends that are real into this, and it really is fascinating. I can see why some people would be super impressed with how a caterpillar can at some point go into this pupa that literally all the tissues get dissolved and are liquid. They get dissolved and then like broken down, and then they get reassembled back into the butterfly. That's a pretty miraculous process, right? To be completely changed like that. And the control of that is usually done by some hormones, which are just chemicals in the body. We're all born with hormones that get either produced or stop being produced. And in this case, it's when they get stopped being produced. Like, there's what are called juvenile hormones. A juvenile hormone is what keeps an insect in its larval form. As the insect matures, the production of that juvenile hormone decreases. At some point, that concentration is going to drop below a certain threshold, and then the next time the animal molts, or the insect molts, remember, an insect is an animal. I remember we talked about molting in the exoskeleton section, where we talked about skeletons and support. The organism, when it molts, at that point, again, when the hormone is below the threshold, it's going to go through a molt in which, when it comes out, it's not just getting rid of its exoskeleton, it's actually becoming a pupa. And then when there's no more juvenile hormone, the pupa will then become an adult. So that's complete metamorphosis. Notice that the complete has a pupa. The incomplete does not have a pupa. You just have a nymph, which grows into an adult. Whereas the complete metamorphosis, you have larvae, which turn into a pupa, which then turn into an adult. Okay, so those are great ways to ask test questions. I'll probably have like 2 or 3 test questions using the vocabulary like nymph, pupa, and larva, and incomplete and complete metamorphosis. All right, so what about amphibians? They usually undergo metamorphosis that also, again, is controlled by hormones that will change them from aquatic to terrestrial, where they're on land. Tadpoles are the perfect example of that. Tadpoles are swimming in the water as aquatic with gills and a tail and flippers, but then they'll mature into adults that are on land, terrestrial, that have legs, lungs, and no tail. Frog. So the tadpole will metamorphosize into a frog. Okay, what about the care of animals? Well, that just is all going to differ. Basically, the point they're trying to make here is that long-term intensive care is usually done by mammals. For example, this mother panda. A wild panda will usually stay with its mother for up to 18 months while she protects it and teaches it how to be a panda. All right, so there's probably some really cool documentaries out there about pandas. I know a lot of you freshmen love pandas because I remember from your presentations you did either the red panda or the typical panda here, and you probably got that from, I'm assuming, some documentary out there. So life cycle of a panda is probably pretty phenomenal. But I'm not and there's so many animals out there. I'll be honest with you, there's certain animals that I have done research on and some I have not. But again, now let's look at how there's some reproductive diversity in chordates. So chordates, remember, have a nerve cord. Now basically, with the amniotic egg, that's going to be a huge benefit here for reproduction. Let's talk about how that works. What's really fascinating about the amniotic eggs is that it can allow the young to develop without the mother even around. It just needs to stay warm usually. But the egg has its own nutrients inside of it. It can develop away from the mother. It can even develop on land where there's no water. That's pretty phenomenal because that's actually one of the terrestrial vertebrate complications there. That's one of the complications experienced by land-dwelling vertebrates. Because if you're in water, it's everything can stay moist and things can move around. They can move around in the water, and then they can be protected that way because water is an awesome solvent for making solutions and things like that. But where's the solution and the nutrients here inside this egg? Well, it's actually in the yolk sac. It's also in the amnion, which is a fluid-filled sac that surrounds and cushions the developing embryo. It produces a protected watery environment. So the egg is pretty fascinating. It has a hard shell, but yet it still has liquid inside to cushion it. It also has the yolk sac, which has solutions of really, really nutrient-rich food supply. It even has what's called a chorion. This region here, it's called this sac here is a chorion, which transports oxygen into the egg and it helps transport carbon dioxide out. Because remember, cellular respiration uses up oxygen and produces CO2. You got to get rid of the CO2. And so that can actually happen here at the chorion. So the amniotic egg is a tremendous, this book says adaptations to life on land, but it's an awesome creation tool is what I would say. Basically, reptiles, birds, and a few mammals have evolved these or have been given the design to have an amniotic egg. Again, the key is that it's outside of the mother's body and it's out of water without drying out. All right. What about some strategies? So for mammalian reproduction strategies, we have 3 different groups you should be familiar with: monotremes, marsupials, and placentals. And they differ greatly in their means of reproduction development. but all nourish their young with mother's milk. So that's one of the keys here for mammals. Mammals have hair, and they have mammary glands to produce milk. And so that's kind of what makes mammals unique. But the simple class of them here, or the simple group, is the monotremes. The monotremes, such as this echidna, it kind of looks like a porcupine, but it's not. They're native to Australia, and they basically are going to lay soft-shelled amniotic eggs that get incubated outside of the body. The eggs will hatch in about 10 days, but like other mammals, young monotremes are usually nourished by milk. So the mother still hangs around because at some point she's got to give milk to the babies through her mammary glands. Now for these monotremes, though, it's actually quite simple. Instead of having like nipples, they're just like little pores on the belly, little pores on the surface of the abdomen in which the milk will be released. So those are your monotremes. Okay, the eggs are just released and they're left to hatch, but the mother still stays around because she's still got to give milk to the young. Remember, we're talking about caring for the young. Caring for the young and reproductive diversity here. Now for marsupials, like the kangaroo, it's a little bit in between. Let's do like we did earlier. Let's look at this extreme, the monotremes, and then the other extreme, which is placentals, and then we'll come back to marsupials. We're on the other extreme as the monotremes. We have it's called a placenta. We just already talked about that earlier. Remember, the placenta is a way that we can literally get when mom eats food, it goes into her bloodstream, and that same blood gets circulated through the umbilical cord to the babies. So placental mammals like seals, or there's a whole list of placental mammals. I'm not going into that. But the point is that placenta is a way, we're almost done, placenta is a way for mom and baby to literally have the same blood. So when mom breathes in oxygen goes into the blood takes oxygen to all her muscles and tissues. It literally takes it to the baby too. And then when the baby needs to get rid of carbon dioxide, it can't breathe out. It's still in fluid, right? So the baby's lungs are there, but they're not working. So how does the baby get rid of its carbon dioxide? Through mom's breath. If mom stops breathing, baby essentially stops breathing, if you will. Or cellular respiration would cease, I should say, as a fact. And so placentals, again, and what mom eats, that's what baby gets. So literally, the baby is totally one with mom, with the organism. What a beautiful, harmonious relationship there, where baby is like the same as the mom for a while. Again, the baby though is still inside of that placenta, inside of its own protected sort of space. It's not literally like an organ in mom, whatever. Now marsupials are kind of in between. So like a marsupial, they're gonna have external pouches like this, and the baby is going to get born at a very early stage of development. So it's like having a premature baby. And usually if humans have premature babies, they got to go to the NICU and stay in an incubator and be monitored all the time and be given, ventilation because its lungs aren't very strong. And it's just always monitored, and it's totally premature, right? And so that's what's going on here, but instead of an incubator, the marsupials have this pouch. It's called the marsupium. The marsupium is a pouch in which there's a nipple, and inside that pouch, the baby will just keep nursing on that nipple for months, actually, drinking milk and growing until they can finally survive independently. All right, so they're kind of in between the placentas and the monotremes. Okay. So the marsupials are not really like inside nursing, but they are outside. Remember, the monotremes, there's nursing going on, but the baby totally develops inside of the egg, all by itself inside the egg, with mom not even there. Mom only needs to come around when the baby needs milk after it's been born. Okay, hopefully you guys captured some of those differences there. I know we looked at a lot of differences there. Just as a quick recap, we looked at different ways that babies can get nourished through the egg and the different ways that they develop that way. We looked at how life cycles will develop and can change from eggs to adults, whether they metamorphosize completely or incompletely. We looked at how embryos can develop again as inside the organism or outside the organism or somewhat in between. We also looked at how there's internal fertilization and external fertilization. Remember, fertilization is just where egg and sperm meet. And then we also looked at the difference between asexual and sexual reproduction. And so know the advantages and disadvantages between both of those. All right. That was, I told you, a long section, so there was a lot to cover there. There will be probably quite a few questions just from this section, so hopefully you're aware of those differences. You could draw Venn diagrams, do whatever it takes. Again, remember, this test will be open book, so you will be able to refer to your textbook or this PDF to answer some questions if you have to find these, but be able to find these paragraphs real quick, know where they are. If you've never seen this section, you'd be lost in where to find the answer to the question that I might give you. So thank you for watching. If you're watching this now, you basically just have one more video, 18.4, and then we're done. Adios.